may be around the world, and thank you for joining us once again on truth2u.org. That's truth number 2 letter u.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counseling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca. Jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Rabbi?
Rabbi, you like that? Every now and then, I just like to throw in. I'd like to throw in a bit of a roll of the R. You know why?
Why is that?
Because not everybody can do it. It's just one of those things, and I whenever I do it, it's just I feel special.
There was a pretzel commercial when I was a kid. Ruffles have ridges.
Hey, there you go.
the
But
rabbi...
not everybody can do it. It's like, for example, can you roll your tongue?
No,
that's
genetic, though. I heard.
That's it. But I think the rolling of the R is a genetic thing as well.
Really?
Everybody, right now, pause the program and see if you can do it. Rolling your R's. Not everyone can. And then see if you can roll your tongue. And there's all sorts of things.
And if you can do it, you're related to Jono.
There's somewhere deep back there, somewhere we're somehow related. There you go. We're the R rollers. We are continuing to investigate the alleged 365 Messianic prophecies in the Tanakh that Jesus supposedly fulfilled in the New Testament. We are in part 2 of the book of Zechariah, and the list does invest heavily in chapter 11, where we're going to be focusing today. On the original list, we are beginning from number 340. We are going to be using, of course, the new Revised Standard Version supplied by Carmen and Bill of the refinersfire.org, and on that list, 275. I don't know that it differs a great deal, but this is where we are. Now, it begins at Zechariah chapter 11, verse 4 to 6. Michael, it does say, "Thus says the Lord my God, feed the flock for slaughter, whose owners slaughter them and feel no guilt, those who sell them and say, Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their shepherds do not pity, for I will no longer pity the inhabitants of the land, says the Lord, but indeed I will give everyone into his neighbor's hand and into the hand of his king. They shall attack the land, and I will not deliver them from their hand." The Messianic prophecy fulfilled according to the list in the New Testament is Matthew 23, verse 1 to 4. It says, "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." And the Messianic prophecy fulfilled, according to the list, at his coming, Israel to have unfit leaders. Michael.
Okay, so we're going to see tonight 13 alleged Messianic prophecies that are taken from this 11th chapter in Zechariah. And there's one common problem to all of them, which is that there's nothing really in this chapter that is messianic or about the Messiah. That's a pretty big problem.
It's huge.
It's a pretty big problem. And
that was a short program. That's the fastest one we've ever done.
Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow. Now, someone might say, well, that's because, Rabbi Skobac, you're spiritually blind and you have scales covering your eyes, and you can't see that it's really about the Messiah. So let me share that my very, very hyperactive open Bible does not give these verses a star, saying that it's a Messianic prophecy.
I don't have any stars.
Yeah, no stars there. And my Holman Christian Standard Bible, Study Bible, does not see this passage in Zechariah 11 as messianic. My New King James Version Study Bible doesn't see this as a messianic passage. My English Standard Version Study Bible doesn't see this as a messianic passage. My New Living Translation Study Bible. I mean, there are numerous Christians who supposedly don't have scales covering their eyes that just readily admit that this passage in Zechariah is not about the Messiah. The Messiah is not mentioned. Actually, many commentaries will say this is not even about the future. It's describing either things in the distant past or in the time of Zechariah. So this is really riddled with problems for the list maker, and we'll try to go through it tonight, but it's going to get a bit monotonous because really we're dealing with one series of about 13 passages that all have this common failure, which is that there's nothing in the passage that is really about the Messiah. It's not a messianic prophecy. Now, to get more sort of drill deeper into this passage here, it's not really even clear the passage is referring to unfit leaders. It's actually a difficult passage to translate, and you'll find many different translations.
I noticed that, yeah.
But it's not entirely clear that it's speaking about unfit leaders. And just to mention something, if it were, let's say Zechariah was telling you, let's say from the list maker's perspective, what's going on is that the Tanakh gave you all these clues to be able to identify the Messiah. So one of the clues is, when the Messiah comes, Israel's going to have unfit leaders. The reason that's such a useless clue is that at any particular time in Jewish history, we probably had some useless leaders and unfit leaders. So it's not a helpful sign, meaning that if it, is the kind of thing that's ubiquitous and at any particular generation, I'm sure that today we have some rabbis that are not really fit rabbis. And I'm sure that that was the case 100 years ago and 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago. So it would be a sort of a meaningless, useless kind of sign for Zechariah to even give. But just reading the text here, it's not entirely clear that the passage in Zechariah even is referring to unfit leaders. What's clear in the passage is that the people of Israel are destined for punishment. Again, it's either describing past punishments that we received or it's referring to future punishments, but that's clearly going on in this passage, that the people are just destined for punishment. And again, perhaps the leaders are unfit, but the text doesn't clearly say that. Now, the proof text that's brought from Matthew 23 is interesting because, number one, it's not so simple for Matthew 23 that the leaders at the time of Jesus were unfit, meaning Jesus criticizes the Pharisees and the scribes as being, hypocritical and not following their own teachings, etc. But that doesn't prove that they're unfit, meaning it's his opinion. But again, for a person, a member of the jury, unless you were already predisposed to believing everything Jesus said and everything the New Testament said, again, it's not proof that the rabbinic leadership at the time of Jesus were unfit or, people that were unworthy, because all you have really is the opinion of Jesus here. And what's interesting is that in Matthew 23, Jesus, if he really is telling us how unfit these people are, it's strange that he begins the chapter by saying that, they have the authority given by Moses, they sit in the seat of Moses, and Jesus says, therefore, everything they teach you, you have to do and you have to observe. I mean, Jesus is not telling anyone in this chapter that they should not follow the teachings of the scribes and Pharisees. He just says that because they don't practice what they preach, he says you shouldn't do what they do, meaning that what they're doing is not really appropriate, Jesus says. But he's not questioning what they're teaching and the accuracy and authority of what they're teaching. So it's not a great passage for the list maker to bring in here to show how unfit these leaders are when Jesus himself gives them the stamp of authority.
The interesting thing I find about this connection is that it's an immediate fulfillment. The list maker is saying here, in this time in history, when Jesus said this, this is an immediate fulfillment that the leaders of Israel, according to Jesus, at least in his opinion, were not fit to be leaders. That's not the case in the next one, I think. I think we're going to find that this is a potential future fulfillment. Shall I read it?
Let's go for it.
Well, it bounces from Zechariah 11, bounces off Zechariah 11, 4-6 again, and this time connects it with Luke 19, 41 to 44, that says, and again, Jesus is saying, and now as he drew near and he saw the city and he wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For days will come when come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you, to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. And according to the list, that messianic prophecy is rejection causes God to remove his protection. But this is, I suppose, a prophecy of Jesus. This is something that is going to happen, and something that had not happened when he speculated so.
Well, I guess the list maker is saying that the part that happened at the time of Jesus was the rejection by the leadership, the rejection by the Jewish people. Although that's not really totally clear, because we see in the Christian Bible that he was widely accepted by many people. It's not clear that the majority of people even rejected him. But it's true that I guess the implication they're saying here is that because they rejected him while he was alive, we see shortly afterwards that the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is destroyed and many people are killed. So that's how they're reading this. That they look at that event from the first century of Jesus, they claim, being rejected, and that led to God removing his protection, and therefore the temple is destroyed. Again, what we saw just a moment ago was that this passage in Zechariah is not about the Messiah, and it's certainly not about the rejection of the Messiah. And again, it doesn't really spell out, when you read those two verses, 4, 5, and 6, those three verses, 4, 5, and 6, it doesn't really spell out in those verses exactly why God is removing his protection from the people. Meaning that the list maker seems to be saying that what you see from the 11th chapter, verses 4 through 6, is that it's specifically the rejection of the Messiah that causes God to remove his protection. What we do see in Zechariah is that God is going to remove his protection, but Zechariah 4 through 6 here does not actually spell out exactly why God is going to remove his protection, or God had removed his protection from the people. As we'll see in a few moments, it will become clear when we get to verse 8. But here, verses 4 through 6 do not mention anything about a Messiah or the rejection of the Messiah. That is all speculative, and it's really sort of forced into this passage by the list maker. By the way, I just should point out that, again, it's not really clear that the passage in Zechariah is really speaking at all about the future. Meaning, many commentaries say that what Zechariah is really describing here are events that took place during the First Temple times. But again, it's I think I said during the first episode that we did on the ground rules that for a passage really to be a meaningful messianic prophecy, it has to be clear, meaning that it would have to be the kind of prophecy that anyone reading it would say, yes, that's clearly speaking about the Messiah. It's clearly a prophecy. The one thing that's clear about this passage in Zechariah is it's not clear, meaning that if you have so many people disagreeing about what it's referring to, whether it's a future prophecy or a past description of what happened, it certainly becomes pretty useless as a messianic prophecy about what's going to happen in the future.
The next one is, again, it bounces off Zechariah chapter 11, verses 4 to 6. It connects it with John chapter 19, verses 13 and 15. Through to 15, it says, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabata. Now, it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, behold your king! But they cried out, away with him, crucify him! And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Now, the messianic fulfillment, according to the list, rejected in favor of another king. They get that from this passage as well in Zechariah. What do you make of it?
Well, what you see here is that they've been, milking this one piece in Zechariah
they have, yeah.
for multiple entries.
All that it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten already 3 fulfillment passages out of this. Again, the verses 4 through 6 here don't really speak about the rejection of anyone. Certainly not rejecting the Messiah for another king. When we get to verse 8, we're going to see that the cause of God's anger here and the cause of why he punishes the people is it very clearly says that the people rejected God himself. It doesn't speak about the rejection of the Messiah. It says that the real issue here in this whole chapter of Zechariah is that the people came to reject God. And John 19 makes it really clear how the list maker went about operating, how the list maker really went through this, constructing this list, because it's clear that they began with John 19, and they looked for some hook in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, to sort of connect it with. So the list maker saw that the people allegedly said, "We have no king but Caesar." So where do you find some kind of a thing pointing to that in the Tanakh? So they say, "Oh, you see here that if you read things into this verse, that these people have rejected, the Messiah, and they're accepting Caesar instead." Again, it sort of violates the integrity of the passage in Zechariah, because there's nothing in Zechariah about a Messiah, about rejection at all. But it's clear that, it's impossible to believe when you read the prophet Zechariah that he is really speaking about this scene where the Jewish people are going to reject the Messiah and give their loyalty instead to Pontius Pilate.
No, it only works if you begin with the New Testament and work backwards, as we've seen so often in this list. Now, before we get to verse 8, we have to do verse 7. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 7. "So I fed the flock for slaughter, in preparation the poor of the, in particular the poor of the flock. I took for myself 2 staffs." Now, in the New King James, Michael, I've got, it says, "The one I called beauty, and the other I called bonds, and I fed the flock." And I think this is a good example of multiple translations that you were talking about earlier. And when I did look out, when I looked at various other translations, it seems more likely that and maybe you can comment on this, the one I called favor, or the one I called grace, and the other one I called unity. What do you have in your translation there? Or how do you read it in the Hebrew?
Most Jewish commentaries or Jewish translations really use these two as contrasting terms. So noam in Hebrew means pleasantness or peacefulness, or usually pleasantness. And so chobelim, I don't have the Hebrew text in front of me, I'm looking at a transliteration, but that would be a contrasting term, and it really would mean not the opposite of peacefulness, which would really, in Hebrew, the term means destroyers, or those who destroy. Wow. So really, God is speaking here about 2 possibilities, and that's one of the sub-themes of this chapter, is that God is essentially laying out for the Jewish people, you've got really 2 paths open to you. The path of following me and obeying me, in which case your life's going to be okay, or rejecting me and rejecting, following me and obeying me, in which case it's not going to be pleasant at all. And it's in your hands.
Well, the list connects this verse with Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 and 36. It says, when Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. Now, the Messianic prophecy fulfilled according to the list is ministry to the, and inverted commas, poor, the believing remnant.
So, again, it's like a broken record here, but this is, it's not a prophecy. It's not a passage here in Zechariah about the Messiah. It's not a messianic prophecy. It's not telling us anything about the person of the Messiah. And again, I showed that there were many Christians that agree with me on that. Also, the poor here may not be the best translation. Meek might be a better translation. And it's, again, speaking about God himself, the passage, that God will be tending and leading those who put their faith in him, and it's got nothing to do here. Zechariah has literally nothing to do with Jesus' ministry to the distressed peoples in the villages that he traveled to. What is interesting to me is that Matthew 9 here doesn't really say that these people that Jesus ministered to were believers. I mean, it speaks about, the list maker speaks about him ministering to the believing remnant, but all it really speaks about in Matthew is that he went around healing people. And it doesn't really tell you, there's no really clear indication that these were real believers, so to speak. Certainly, when we talk about a believing remnant, they're not just superficial believers, they're real believers. And one of the things this reminded me of was that modern day missions that travel all around the world to convert large numbers of people, they have a vested interest in showing their success rates and how many people they converted. And so often what happens is they have these superficial conversions. People attend a large stadium, revival meeting or a rally or some kind of a concert. And, at the end, they'll ask people to raise their hands if they want to receive the Lord into their lives. And everybody's hand goes up. I mean, part of that is sort of the bandwagon approach that, if you're in a stadium with 30,000 people and, 10,000 put their hands up, you're going to put your hand up. But these are usually people that are not stable believers. I actually saw this once in a very interesting report that there was a Jewish missionary organization that used to travel to the former Soviet Union when the walls came down and they had freedom to go there. And they would have these huge, massive rallies at these stadiums. And they were reporting that they had, 120, 60,000, 90,000, professions of faith. That's how they were reporting. Now, these are people that would come in and once every 6 months or whatever, once a year, they would run a big concert or a big stadium rally. But there were other groups that were actually there in those cities that were working year-round. And, when you read their reports, they would say that they maybe were able to convert 1,000 people. So why is it that, the first group was claiming, 60, 90, 100,000 converts, and they were only there 1 or 2 days a year, and the people that were there on the ground all the time, were only saying they converted a few hundred or 1,000 people? The difference is very simple. The people at the stadium rallies were counting as full converts anyone that would raise their hand. They could have been saying, if you want to receive a free Bible, raise your hand, or what have you. But they're not necessarily real believers, and the good chance is that these are people that, we're not going to become necessarily full believers or real believers, whereas the people that were on the ground were only counting as converts those people that they discipled and really became what they considered to be true believers. So Matthew 9 here doesn't really tell us anything about whether these people that he was going around and healing became ultimately true believers. That's just an editorial comment from me.
The next one is Zechariah chapter 11, verse 8. Now, this is the verse. It says, I dismissed the 3 shepherds in 1 month. My soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. The list matches this verse with Matthew chapter 28, verse 33, which says, Michael? That's right, it's not there. It doesn't exist. There's no such verse. What are we going to do?
Was that a trick question?
It's not there. I don't know, Bill. What were you thinking? I mean, anyway. So there is no verse. I don't know but apparently this imaginary verse is the Messianic prophecy fulfilled to this imaginary verse, according to the list, is unbelief of Israel's leaders forces Messiah to reject them.
Okay, so again, this is more of the same. That if we've seen, this passage in Zechariah is not speaking about the rejection of the Messiah, but the people rejecting God, and that brings God's punishment upon them. And so what Zechariah is describing is God's rejection, really, and not the Messiah rejecting the people, meaning it's God rejecting the people, not the Messiah rejecting the people. And this very obtuse proof text only really works if you begin with the outlandish kind of assumption that Jesus is God. Once you sort of make that equivalence, that, well, of course it's talking about Jesus because it's referring to God and Jesus is God, so then it's got to be talking about Jesus. I remember that from math class when I was in 7th or 8th grade. If A is B and B is C, then A is C. But in that case, every single thing that's said in the Tanakh about God is also about Jesus, or axiomatically. So what happens is, if that's the case, if all this only works, if you make the a priori assumption that Jesus is God, so the list maker would only be preaching to the choir, and any member of the jury would just roll their eyes. I mean, that's how much this really functions as a proof text to someone who's sitting on the jury.
Well, we've got another one in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 8. We can do something with this because this corresponding verse in the New Testament actually does exist. I'm going to read it again. I dismissed the 3 shepherds in 1 month. My soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. Connected with Matthew chapter 27, verse 20. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The Messianic prophecy fulfilled, according to the list, is the word despised.
Well, we've discussed this in the past. Could you really use this term about Jesus when in the New Testament, he's portrayed as a superstar, and it's really hard to say that he was certainly someone that was despised.
We discussed it in the last program,
Yeah.
unless because he did the circus trick coming in through the gates on the donkey and the colts, and everyone was thrilled with that. I thought it was wonderful, and yelled out Hosanna in the highest, and so on and so forth. And only a few days later, here he is. We're supposed to believe totally rejected.
Yeah, and the main problem here is that this chapter again is not about the Messiah being rejected, but about God Himself being rejected. Now, the verse refers to God removing 3 shepherds from the nation in 1 month.
Yeah, what's it got to do with this?
Well, so it's first of all, it's impossible to find anything in the New Testament that corresponds to anything like this in the time of Jesus. So it's sort of a further proof that whatever is going on in Zechariah has absolutely nothing to do with the story of Jesus, because it's an example of the list makers sort of cherry picking those phrases that they can apply to Jesus, but they ignore the entire context here of what's going on. Now, there have been dozens of suggestions as to really what this refers to. Some Jewish commentaries suggest that it might be referring to King Jehoram of the northern kingdom and Ahaziah of Judah, the southern kingdom, and his potential successor, who were all murdered by Jehu at the same time. That's in 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10. Or some people say that it might refer to the 3 sons of Josiah, who was the king of Judah. So that would be Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Tzidkiyahu, which would be in 2 Kings 23 and 25. Some people say it might refer to the last 3 prophets, who basically, when they left the scene, prophecy ended. So that would be Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. But it's not really clear who these 3...
It's not clear. I've got another one as well in my Jewish study Bible that says, emendation yields 1/3 of the flock. Does that ring a bell at all?
I didn't see that particular commentary, but...
Another one as well, anyhow.
It doesn't seem to flow with the translation, though. It seems to be speaking about 3 personages, 3 personalities. But it's not really clear what that might be referring to in the gospel accounts.
Particularly in this verse. I mean, I cannot see a possible connection. And usually we're scraping the bottom of the barrel for a connection, whether it be a similar word or a similar phrase or a similar theme, but I don't even see that between these.
It was
verses.
Ignored, basically. The list maker and anyone that
I think the list maker's getting lazy at the end of the list.
I don't think so.
Maybe that's what's happening. They're over it. Like some movies, you watch some movies and it seems to be going pretty, they're doing pretty well. But then by the time they get to the ending, it just sort of falls apart, and it's kind of like saying, we've been working on this for months now, and we're over it. And we're glad you enjoyed it so far, but we couldn't be bothered tying it together in a way that really made sense, and we just want to go home. You know what I mean? Okay. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 9. Then I said, I will not feed you. Let what is dying die, and what is perishing perish. Let those that are left eat each other's flesh. Oh, my word. And the corresponding verse in the New Testament, Matthew 23, verse 38 and 39. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. All right, and the Messianic prophecy fulfilled stops ministering to those who reject him. Oh, please!
You don't sound very impressed.
It's just getting silly now, isn't it?
It's like beating a dead horse at this point.
Oh,
I like that expression. It is.
Yeah.
It's beating a dead horse, and we've already seen that this passage is just not about the Messiah or the rejection of the Messiah. It's basically about God punishing those who reject Him, and end of story, really.
Yeah, let's move on. Good heavens. All right, Zechariah chapter 11, verse 10. And I took my staff beauty, and I cut it in two, that I might break the covenant which I had made with all the peoples. This is connected with Luke chapter 19, verse 41 to 44. And now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, we've read this already when Jesus says, I'll read it. If you had known, even you especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you and to the ground. They will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. The Messianic prophecy fulfilled according to the list is rejection causes God to remove protection. Didn't we do this?
Yes, I'm going to basically say that we did this, we've been there, did that, got the T-shirt. Let's move on.
Got the T-shirt. But now, can we just return? I mean, let's make a little bit of sense of this for a second. Forget the New Testament and the list. Zechariah 11 verse 10. What are some interpretations there? What's being said here, Michael?
Well, it's basically it's in line with the entire thrust of this chapter, which is God is essentially laying out for the people, again through the prophet Zechariah, that their fate is in their hands, and that there are always these choices of either going in the right direction and, being supported by God and having a life that's pleasant and beautiful, or rejecting God and having a life of misery. And, there's nothing more mysterious really than that's going on in this chapter.
Is there some sort of connection at all? Because we see two sticks, and then they're being cut in two. In Ezekiel, we see two sticks and they become one.
So there are some commentaries that, again, I mentioned that they really look at this really as something that happened in the past. So some of the commentaries take that reference, the two sticks, as the two kingdoms that split off from each other. And Ezekiel speaks about them coming back together as one. So again, when you go through the commentaries who sort of micro dissect this passage, they try to connect it with different events in Jewish history, either past, present, or future. And it's hard to really know who's correct. That's why I said I think the clearest thing about this chapter is that all the exact references are not that clear. But the general theme is clear. The general theme is that, the people are being told in no uncertain terms that, following God will be good for you, and not following God is just going to be miserable.
It's going to be miserable. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 11. So it was broken on that day. Thus the poor of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of the Lord. That is connected with John chapter 14, verse 7. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also, and from now on you do know him and have seen him. I have no idea why those two are connected. The Messianic prophecy fulfilled, according to the list, is the Messiah would be seen as having authority from God. But of course, in 11, verse 11, there's nothing about the Messiah. Michael, help me out.
I remember in my previous incarnation seeing a movie called Annie Hall, where some loudmouth.
Your previous incarnation.
In a previous life. I've disassociated myself from Woody Allen after he married his daughter. But I loved Annie Hall, and I remember there's a scene where he's at a movie theater with Diane Keaton, and there's some loudmouth online who is pontificating about Marshall McLuhan. And Woody Allen is just livid, and he says to himself he wished that Marshall McLuhan was there to shut this guy up. And that's what happens. He sort of appears from behind a plant. And so I just wish that we could get Zechariah in here to state the obvious, that this passage is not about the Messiah. It never mentions the Messiah. There's nothing in here that mentions the Messiah. It's not about the Messiah. Numerous Christian commentaries agree that it's not about the Messiah. So let's just get over this and spare everyone the monotony, because it's just
it's painful.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's embarrassing and it's painful. I think this is one of the worst compilations on the list so far. Anyhow, we have to continue because it's on the list. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12 to 13. Then I said to them, If it is not agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. That princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. Now, this is connected with Matthew 26, verse 14 to 15. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you, being Jesus, if I deliver Jesus to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. The Messianic prophecy fulfilled, according to the list, is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. But what is, Michael, what's going on in Zechariah 11, 12 to 13?
Well, what's fascinating really here is that all of a sudden my open Bible woke up and gives these verses stars, meaning that verses 12 and 13 all of a sudden become Messianic prophecies. And what it proves to me, and this is so significant, is that the open Bible, whoever gave these stars out, sort of is proving for all of us that these verses here are being taken out of context, because the open Bible itself didn't say that anything previously in this passage was Messianic prophecy or about the Messiah. So clearly in this chapter, even according to the open Bible, was not about the Messiah. All of a sudden, verses 12 to 13 become Messianic prophecies. Now, part of the reason is that this is a passage that the New Testament itself quotes, so you can't really ignore that.
Oh, you can't. Yeah, that's right. It can't be ignored.
You're sort of forced into saying that it's a Messianic prophecy, but the truth,
mind you, they did. The list maker ignores the one in Hosea chapter 11. We saw that only a few programs ago, because that one's mentioned in the book of Matthew, I do believe. But here they've chosen to acknowledge it. The weird thing about it, though, is, who is the I? Then I said to them, who is the I in Zechariah 11, verse 12 to 13? I mean, in Matthew, obviously, the I is Judas Iscariot. But who is the I in Zechariah?
So according to most people that read this, at least from a Jewish perspective, it's God that's speaking. And what's important to just understand is that the list maker is talking about the Messiah being betrayed, but there's nothing in this passage. If you read the passage carefully, here verses 12 to 13, nothing in this passage about anyone being betrayed. Certainly not the Messiah being betrayed. So what normally is understood here is that God in this passage is speaking of himself as the shepherd of the people. And he's saying to the people, look, if you want me to continue being your shepherd, if you're going to want me to function as your shepherd, you're going to have to pay my fee. What does that mean? You're going to send a money order to God. He doesn't need our money. So it's understood to be figuratively as referring to, if you want to have God protecting you and you want God to be our shepherd, we've got to keep his commandments. We got to repent of our sins. We have to turn to doing good. That's God's fee, so to speak. And if the people don't, pay this fee, he's going to stop protecting them. That's the general thrust of the passage. And, what's impossible is to imagine what the list maker is really claiming here, meaning that it's impossible to imagine that when Zechariah wrote these verses, he was really thinking about Judas Iscariot speaking to the chief priests. I mean, it's impossible to imagine, and I wonder, do the list makers really think that this passage in Zechariah is actually speaking about this interaction between Judas Iscariot and the chief priests? I mean, seriously, do they really think that's what is happening here in the passage in Zechariah? So it's again a sort of blatant example of taking something from the New Testament and literally forcing it, shoehorning it back into the prophet Zechariah. But there's just nothing, there's no foundation, there's no basis for this at all.
So I'm looking at to try and figure it out. I mean, it's a bit odd. I'm looking at the study notes in my Christian translation, the New King James Study Bible, Nelson Study Bible, and it says of verse 12, Zechariah is taking the role of a Messianic shepherd. Well, of course, there's nothing... Anyway, a Messianic shepherd requesting his wages for service rendered. His wage was calculated as 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. See Exodus 21:32. And this was the price paid to Judas for betraying Jesus. Well, yeah, okay, so maybe it was, but what's that? How does that then bring the two verses together? The notes on verse 13 says the command "throw it to the potter" is further illustrated by Zechariah's actions. He threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. The potters may have been connected with the temple because of the continual need for sacred vessels, and they've referenced Leviticus 6:28. That's all they've got to offer on that. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, there's nothing really in Zechariah about a potter. What Zechariah speaks about is throwing, this sum of money to the treasurer, in the temple. So there's nothing here about a potter.
Oh, okay. Because I've got potter. You've got treasurer. Okay. So now let me just have another look at throw it. Yeah. Okay. So Hashem said to me, "Throw it to the treasurer of the precious stronghold." It has treasurer instead of potter. How odd. Yeah. Why do we have potter?
Well, because
in Christian translation. Because that's what the New Testament says.
Apparently.
How very odd. Is there a similarity in the way it's spelt in Hebrew or something? Is there?
I don't think so. I don't know where they get this from, but
very strange. Now I have two hollow stars next to these references, and in the foreword of my study Bible it says in regards to prophetic stars, many cross-references include stars that are designated Messianic prophecies. An open star, which is what I've got, refers to a prediction, while a solid star points out a fulfillment of a prophecy related to the coming of the Messiah, the Lord Jesus. So, whatever that means, the open stars, they refer to these two verses as predictions.
Yeah, and my open Bible does the same thing. That all of a sudden, it wakes up and it says that these two verses here are Messianic, where it didn't say that about the previous verses in the chapter.
And yet there's nothing in it. Let's move on. Zechariah chapter 11, verse 13, and the Lord said to me, well, we've just done this one. We're milking it again. Hang on, wait a minute. What's going on here? Have they listed it twice?
No, we just, the first, number 284 was 12 and 13 in tandem, and now it's sort of zeroing in on verse 13 for 285.
Yeah, okay, hang on. So 284 is Zechariah 11, 12, and 13, and the reference was Matthew 26, 14, and 15.
Right, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver.
Betrayed. Now the next one is Zechariah 11, 13, and again we have Matthew 26, 14, and 15. We also have... We also have John chapter 1 verse 11. He came to his own, and to his own he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. And the messianic fulfillment, according to the list, is that he was rejected.
A lot of rejection going on here tonight. So the truth is that this passage, if you read the words of Zechariah, it's not speaking about anyone being betrayed or rejected. Other than the Almighty. And to me, the list maker has been just out of control tonight. I mean, I literally wanted to bang my head into the wall going through this list because it's so infuriating.
This is the worst set of, I mean, they've all been pretty...
I had to take some Pepto-Bismol today, Gold. I really did.
Long-time listeners to this program know that the list has certainly been wanting. I mean, we've come across nothing so far. The list has turned up, but it's been kind of interesting in any case because there's been, at the very least, as I often mention, there's some sort of a connection. But this is just, what is this? I don't even know what this is. This is nothing.
Well, it's repeating the same thing over and over again, which is that, God is rejected by the people, and God punishes them, takes away his protection, and that becomes expanded into literally 13 different verses here tonight, saying basically the same thing. It's just regurgitating the same concept over and over and over again. That's why it's a little bit monotonous. What's going on here in the verse, though, is that God is saying to Zechariah here, take these 30 pieces of silver and to throw them into the treasury of the temple. Almost all the commentaries understand this figuratively. They say, really read this symbolically as not actually God having him take 30, and even if he did take 30 pieces of silver, it would have really been symbolic of something. And it's understood in context to be referring to basically the idea that there are some righteous people, and God is really sort of indicating that the righteous people should either be kept separate from the rest of the people, meaning these are the people that were willing to pay God's wages. These are the people that were willing to obey God and follow God and keep the Torah and be obedient. So either they're being separated from other people, or the placing of this payment in the temple treasury is a way of saying that their merits will be documented and preserved, and ultimately, they'll be rewarded one day. But again, there's nothing here in the context that really speaks about the rejection of the Messiah at all. This is just all based upon a sort of presupposition of the list maker. You can't really, in any kind of clear way, extract that idea from the words of Zechariah. And then the next one basically is the same thing.
The next one just beats the dead dog again. Zechariah 11:13. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the, and now I've got Potter, throw it to the treasurer, that princely price they set on me. So I took 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the house of the Lord for the potter. The corresponding verse, Matthew chapter 27, verse 3 to 5. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. The Messianic prophecy fulfilled according to the list is, which one? Oh, here we are. 30 pieces of silver thrown into the house of the Lord.
This is important to understand that when you read Zechariah itself here, he's not forecasting anything that's going to happen in the future, hundreds of years in the future. The passage in Zechariah is actually describing what Zechariah himself did. It's a narrative. It's saying that because God gave him this message, he actually took this money and he threw it into the treasury of the temple. So that it's really describing something that actually took place in the times of Zechariah, and there's no indication at all, nothing that sort of pops out that tells you that really it's talking about something that's going to happen similarly in the distant future.
Now, unfortunately, this is the way we have to end it. And I apologize to the listeners. This is the worst program we've ever done. But it's not our fault. We're just going through the list. That finishes Zechariah chapter 11 by bouncing off verse 13 again. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that princely price, or the treasurer, that princely price they set on me. So I took 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the house of the Lord for the treasurer. And it connects it with John chapter 12, verse 45, which says, and he who sees me sees him who sent me. Oh, man. And the Messianic prophecy fulfilled is the Messiah would be equated to God. Oh, yes. Please, what can we do with this?
Well, I wanted to pull the remaining hairs out of my head when I saw this one. I really did. This really sums it up for tonight. Here we have a passage in Zechariah.
This is terrible.
Yeah, it is pretty sad. Again, it's very clear what was happening here tonight. That there were all these ideas that are clearly in the Christian Bible, and this passage was the innocent victim where they all landed. This poor chapter 11 in Zechariah became, the ground zero for all these, Christological passages. This became the place where they were all, hooked up to. I don't have any idea how the list maker arrived at the conclusion that you see from this verse in Zechariah that the Messiah would be God himself.
I've got no idea.
It's almost impossible. Again, I think it's based upon a preconceived axiom of the list maker, which begins reading Genesis with the conviction that Jesus is God. And therefore, if Jesus is
But
God,
that's not even reflected. I mean, I know, we know, but how does that? I mean, reading Zechariah 11:13, where is? There's nothing in it that.
well,
I don't know.
if it's talking about God, it's God. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Islamic assertion that Abraham was a Muslim. I mean that
Right.
it's sort of that's their perspective that when they read the Hebrew Bible, anyone in the Hebrew Bible that was a good guy must have been a Muslim. So when this list maker reads the Hebrew Bible, anything that's about God it's about Jesus.
It's about Jesus.
And that's the end. That's sort of that's the proof.
Well, if we read it that way, I mean, let's just play that game for a minute. And then Jesus said to me, "Throw it to the potter. That princely price they set on me." So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of Jesus for the potter. But that doesn't make sense because I mean, Judas went to he went back to the chief priests and elders and said, "What do I do with this money?" And they said, "Whatever, we don't care." They didn't say, "Go and ask Jesus what to do with it."
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't understand.
Yeah, I think
This is
that
terrible.
we need to get our glasses checked or something because we clearly are not. We're not seeing how this proves anything about the Messiah being equated to God.
Now, I promise you, listeners, dear listeners, next week is going to be much better because there is a little bit of substance. There's some connections to grasp onto for the Christians when we get to Zechariah chapter 12 and even more interestingly, Zechariah, or maybe equally so, Zechariah chapter 13. We may be able to. Are we going to be able to do both of those in one program?
It's a possibility. Yeah, I'm hoping.
Chapter 12 and chapter 13. Possibly we'll get those done next week. Now, if we do that, by the way, Michael, if we do that, after that we've got, I think, one program to go, and it's Malachi.
We'll have to make a party.
We'll have to have a party, and maybe we'll do one final sum-up program. But in any case, that's it. That's the worst program we've ever done. It's not our fault. It's the list maker's fault. I feel like I should write an email to Bill and complain because this is just, I don't know, of the refinersfire.org. Or maybe the listeners can do that. Write into the refinersfire.org and complain. Say, Bill, what is going on? You really should have gone through this with a little bit more of a microscope. I don't know. It needs to go back in the refiner's fire.
I agree. Okay,
done. Okay, thank you. Rabbi Michael Skobac of JewsForJudaism.ca. JewsForJudaism.ca. My goodness. If you want some worthy content, you're going to find it there, but you're not going to find it in this program, this list. Zechariah chapter 11. But JewsForJudaism.ca is the website. Thank you, my friend, for coming back on. Until next week, dear listeners, when we're going to really have a very interesting program. Just have a wonderful week. Be blessed. Be set apart by the truth of our Father's word. Shalom. That was seriously the worst part of the list.
I agree. It was painful going through it. It really was.
It was just terrible.
I feel we should send an apology letter to Zechariah.
Yeah, we should.
Saying, what did I deserve? How did I deserve this?
And a complaint to Bill.
Yeah, it really was bad. But next week, actually, Zechariah 12 is actually not just juicy, but it's actually hard. It's a hard passage. The language is difficult. So, it has this expression, which is not easy in Hebrew, et asher. And then there's the word dakaru, which is not there. It's a really juicy passage. There's a lot really happening there. So it'll be night and day to this week. Night and day.